and welcome to episode 11 of the Brewed Sages, Stormbound players with a head for the game. I am Freeloader, and with me as always are my co-hosts Sabaiku and Arthas. Sabaiku, how is it going tonight?
Fantastic.
And Arthas, how are you doing?
I am doing very well, actually.
Glad to hear that. We are the Brewed Sages, and as a reminder, you can always contact us at Brewed Sages on Twitter. Or for all of those of you who used to play Tetris on your TI-85, our email address is thebrewedsages@gmail.com. So guys, this week we have our second meta report out. Arthas, remind us a little bit of what is the meta report? Why do we have it?
So we have what we call the BS Meta Report, BS short for Brewed Sages. It's also kind of funny as an acronym. But right, the purpose of this meta report is to educate the Stormbound community of what the meta is like. Mostly focusing towards like the gold and platinum leagues and a little bit of diamond, but it gives a really nice summary and visual of what is strong right now, what kind of archetypes, what kind of factions, and the way we get this kind of data is we have surveys sent to dedicated meta report reporters, and we answer questions such as like, oh, what are the most common archetypes that we find? What kind of factions? And then after we gather like the most common archetypes, we end up ranking what we believe, and also from our like experience, what kind of archetypes would prevail over the others, and if eventually getting like an overall power visual on like which archetypes are the strongest and also most played. So having this meta report, it really gives a very nice summary of what the meta is like in Stormbound recently.
And Sabaiku, what are if you're gonna load up Stormbound right now, what can you expect to see, and what should you be planning on countering right now?
You should be prepared to counter the three most popular decks in the game, which are Winter Control, Ironclad Midrange, and Swarm Rush. And Swarm Rush is unsurprising. A lot of people use that as their go-to for trying to rank up. You get those games in fast, and you get to outrush your opponents even if they are over-leveled for you. So those are the three most common archetypes. It doesn't mean that that's all that you'll see, and you'll certainly see some variation amongst those, but that's what you should expect. Looking at our relative power rankings, we now have two tier 1 decks up from last month. We have Winter Pack Control, but the top spot has been taken by Ironclad Midrange, and these growth focused, usually construct based or dragon based or both, Ironclad decks are definitely a response to the winter meta that we saw last month. As we talked about on the episode where we first discussed the meta report and what we were trying to do with it, we talked about how that mid-range archetype counters the control archetype really well by just putting too much value on the board, units that are too big and too hard to clear easily. And I think you're seeing that here with the rise of Ironclad in our power rankings. Interestingly, our third deck, which is sitting at the top of tier 2, is a Shadowfen mid-range deck. So while it may not be the most popular played deck right now, it still does a good job of countering the winter deck and can hang on its own with an Ironclad mid-range. Following that, in tier 2, you have Shadowfen Rush, which again punches up and really stands a good chance against all of the most popular decks right now. Ironclad Control, Swarm Rush, Ironclad Rush, and Winter Pack mid-range is the bottom of tier 2 in our rankings. But Arthas, I'll let you talk about that. How has your Winter Pact mid-range freeze deck been working for you?
I'm still working on optimizing them because it is a very different kind of playstyle than I'm used to. I mean, I'm usually a control player, and playing something that's not as obvious of a mid range as like Ironclad with like buffing. Winterpack mid range, I focus on putting large bodies like things like Rhyme or Prowlers or Mistwives, and just converting the mana gained from like Zavana and the kind of value you get from freeze into just a lot of tempo. It's still very competitive, definitely, especially in the top. It's still really competitive, but it's definitely not as strong as the top three we have, being like Ironclad mid range, Winter Pack Control, and Shadowfen mid range, but it's definitely capable of winning games when you really try your hardest.
Yeah, I think that's that's what people should take tier 2 to be, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
they're not the most optimized and powerful decks in the meta, but if you're good at them, you certainly can get to the highest ranks using them.
Yeah, for sure.
So, Arthas, walk me through how you think the Sheepyard balance changes at the start of this month have impacted the meta, given how different this meta report looks from last month's.
I mean, Shadowfen midrange got hit pretty hard with the Rain of Frogs nerf, especially level 5, because now that it's 2 mana instead of 1, it has much less pressure in the early game, especially with things like Bragda decks or even Kindred's Grace or Klaxi. It's still very, very strong, but it really seems like a Shadowfen midrange, especially its popularity, not necessarily its power, because you can't doubt the kind of strength that Shadowfen midrange with Toad spam can really do. But in terms of popularity, it's definitely decreased. I mean, looking at the meta report, seems to be like the what is it, fourth, fifth or so most common archetype seen in the meta so far. Still definitely really strong, but that nerf really got a lot of people, especially when I read in the Discord what their opinions are and experience with it. A lot of people say it ruined their play style with mid range when it got nerfed, but it was definitely overdue. Definitely deserved it. But other things like with freeze, the freeze rework now being able to silence units, and the rework to icicle burst that now it can freeze. It very I'm pretty sure that those two changes alone made it so that something like winter pack mid range and freeze or even winter pack control now has definitely like shot up in terms of the meta because of how much impact these cards now have relative to other stuff.
Yeah, we were seeing virtually no winter pack mid range last month, right? And now
Yeah,
suddenly
exactly.
it's a tier 2 deck.
It's really nice that I'm not seeing Winter Aaron all the time. Even when I battle against Winter, I see them play some freeze and then some really big bodies, like the mid range that you're used to seeing. It's really nice to see a different kind of archetype now that freeze is much more viable. And one more thing, with the Cordia buff, with now it costing 6 mana instead of 7, we can see a rise of Shadowfen Rush. It is very, very close to the power level of Shadowfen mid range, and I can definitely agree with this, especially in my own experience. Cordia is really, really powerful in a Shadowfen Rush deck, and I'm seeing a lot of success from other people too in the Discord.
Admittedly, coming from 3 Shadowfen players, definitely my choice for the meta breaker. If you're looking to try to sneak out some games against a winter pack control deck, if you're looking to try to outrush an ironclad mid-range deck and still provide good flexibility against the swarm rush that's very prevalent, Shadowfen Rush is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, and the advent of Cordia. So a lot of these decks, I know the deck recipe that Sabaiku and I used to run was it topped out at 6 with Hairy Chestnuts. And Hairy Chestnuts was a fine card for the deck, a little too value oriented. You rarely could afford to play it on 6 because you needed to apply additional pressure, and just one large unit was never adequate.
No, it was something you played on 8 or 9 mana when the game got away from you, when you were looking to just chip your opponent down to finish him off.
Right. A lot of times you wouldn't play it. You would throw a runner in to knock them to 4 or something like that, and then you would play it next to a unit that was already out, play Toxic Sacrifice on the other unit, and then hit end turn and let your opponent's unit hit it for the last little bit. Cordia is just better. It's egg spam instead of toad spam, but that's fine because as a rush deck, you just want to put more stuff on the board than your opponent can afford to clear. And I have to tell you, there is something so satisfying about on turn 5 playing something like I'm just making Heliotrooper's Rain, and watching your opponent respond with Bladestorm, and then you just say, okay, well, I'll just Cordia now.
It's so good that I was basically running the same deck in the Dragon Brawl. Cordia was my only dragon, and it worked out just fine.
All right, guys. Well, with that, I think this is a nice, because we've talked a little bit about tempo and value, I think this is a nice segue into the main discussion that we want to have tonight. We'd like to have a discussion about the difference between tempo and value, specifically how it relates to Stormbound. All right. And the purpose of having this conversation is a lot of you have posted your deck list on Reddit or in the Discord, and you've received very good but very concise feedback of lower your mana curve and add a finisher. And while that may not be wrong, we want to have a conversation about how to build a deck that is either an aggressive tempo oriented deck or a control value oriented deck, and what those two terms mean, tempo versus value, but also how to understand how to balance the two, because in a mid-range deck there should be a balance between the two. Okay, so for the purpose of this discussion and how we're going to use these terms, let's try to think of tempo. Sabaiku, walk me through, what is tempo in Stormbound?
Tempo is board presence. Tempo is putting as much stats on the board as far forward as you can, and you're trying to convert your resources into stats as efficiently as possible and try to beat out your opponent that way. The board situation, what you see presented to you, will tell you what to prioritize. Do you prioritize moving 2, or do you prioritize putting something a little bigger on the board? Do you prioritize trying to flood the board or put one strong unit down? Those are decisions that you have to make in game, but in general, tempo is focused on putting stats on the board.
I would amend that with putting stats as far forward on the
Yeah, so
board as possible,
that comes
right?
with strength and movement.
I think between the two of, let's say, both 5 health, Lawless Herd is a 5 health 2 mana unit. Recruits could also be a 5 health 2 mana unit. One of those moves it forward. It's a more aggressive, more higher tempo play to play one of the two, just because it's moving that front forward, right? So
there's definitely a trade-off between stats and movement, right? Like you said, Lawless Herd and Gifted Recruits. Lawless Herd is 6 strength at level 5. Gifted Recruits is 5 strength at level 5. One moves one doesn't. If you look at the 4 mana slot, I think there's some really obvious examples, right? Cabin Girls is a 0 movement versus Gold Grubbers, that's 1 movement, versus Warfront Runners, that's 2 movement, or Rapid Mousers, that's 3 movement. And you see the strength steadily decline as the movement increases.
Yeah, to the point of uselessness in Rapid Mousers.
And I would argue uselessness in the case of Cabin Girls also a lot of the time, right? Like
Yeah,
the extremes are situational, but in general, something that moves 1 or 2 and also has a decently sized body for the mana cost, and that's something that I prioritize as a rush player focused on tempo. I tend to focus on stats per mana cost.
Yeah, very good point.
Combined with the movement.
Yeah. And I think if you're building a tempo oriented deck, thinking about it in terms of a ratio of stats to mana is a good way of at least starting that build, right?
And if you want to think about stats for mana, if you look at something like Gifted Recruits is 2.5 at level 5 strength per mana.
Okay.
Green Prototypes is 5-1 strength per mana, right? Like that's a huge discrepancy. The cheaper movement, the cheaper unit has the same movement, but a much higher strength to mana ratio.
Sure, it has a drawback though.
It does have a drawback, absolutely. But when you're just playing it for tempo, you don't actually care about the drawback.
For sure.
Definitely one of the most common questions from newer players. Why would I put this in my deck? It doesn't do anything. Well, the answer is it gives you tempo, it gives you movement, and it gives you strength on the board. Even though there's a drawback, it's still worth it. If you look at something like Hearthguards or Linked Golems, right? Those are cards that have a drawback. You have to meet the condition of either having a structure on the board or having another construct on the board. But if you can meet that condition, it's a high tempo play. You get big stats for the mana, and you get movement as well.
Right.
And now that we've talked a good chunk about tempo, which we will expand on later, on the other side of the Stormbound gameplay, there is also value that is very important in terms of understanding the game and what to do. Now, what we have here is that value is defined as gaining a resource advantage over your opponent. So these kind of things include investment cards, things like a True Shot, where they don't actually give too much value or tempo in the beginning, but definitely ramps up over time as it deals damage while as it survives. Other cards like even like Frozen Core, that one is more of an investment, but it gives you that explicit resource advantage, being in the case of mana. And this is the kind of stuff that you see with value. More common types of value would be cards that really focus on clearing the board. Things like a lot of AoE or a lot of single target damage. These are the kind of things that don't necessarily give you a lot of tempo in terms of like strength or movement, but it definitely denies the opponent their own tempo and also gives you a lot more value for the kind of mana that you're expending. So we'll try to compare the different kind of priorities and impacts you find from doing a tempo play versus a value play, and what kind of significance those two affect on whatever archetype you're playing or playing against.
Right. And so to talk through this, we need to define what the resources in the game are, right? There's several resources in the game. The three that we'll talk about are mana, cards in hand, and your health, right? Your health is, in fact, a resource. Just ask anyone who plays Broken Truce or, Restless Goats. It's something that you can expend, and certain cards allow you to do so positively. But for the time being, let's focus first on the most obvious, which is mana. All right. You can only do so much with each turn, and that's defined by the mana, which increments up every turn. There are cards that allow you to directly manipulate mana. We've complained about several of them, Gift being one of the biggest, and of course Gift being even more broken when you can play it early with errands. So cards that allow you to add to your mana pool on a given turn are incredibly powerful, but they do nothing on their own for helping you win the game. They are value plays. So thinking about it from another play, from another way, tempo cards that play around with mana would be cards that are overpowered for the mana cost because of a drawback. I'm thinking of things like Heliotroopers or Dubious Hags, right? Things that maybe benefit your opponent potentially, not necessarily. But it's the units are high tempo. They give you tons of stats on the board, maybe even moving forward because of that drawback. Green prototypes, as Sabaiku already mentioned, I've often, when I've coached people building decks, to think of green prototypes in general as a 1 mana move your front. Like if it was a spell that was just 1 mana, move your front forward 1, you would certainly consider about playing it. The fact that sometimes it could actually clear a unit for you is fantastic. That's a whole extra bonus on top of it. But thinking about it in terms of tempo, it's putting stats further forward on the board for 1 mana. That's a fantastic play. It's cheaper than it should be because of the drawback. So tempo cards can manipulate mana as well. They do so by giving you this sort of drawback kind of idea. In terms of value examples of manipulating, we've mentioned a couple. Aaron, Gift, Queen is another one that was a pretty big offender. It still is a pretty large offender. It's just not seen as much because the combination with Bucks is missing. And certainly a lot of the towers. Although I would suggest, and we'll talk about this next, Sabaiku, that towers can be thought of as card advantage because most of the towers effectively are playing a card for you at the start of your turn in perpetuity.
Sort of. I think that does depend on the tower, but I definitely understand where you're coming from with that. So let's talk about your cards as a resource. This is a little bit odd to consider because your cards aren't really a resource, right? Everyone starts with 12 in their deck. Everyone has 4 in their hand at once, and sure, you can cycle one of those out to try to get a new one, but it's not a resource, right?
Well,
I think it is, absolutely, right? Playing more cards than your opponent, even when you're spending the same amount of mana on those cards, is a tempo advantage. If your opponent plays one 5 mana card and you play a 3 mana and a 2 mana, you've probably put more stats on the board than them, and you've probably distributed those bodies in a way that's harder for your opponent to react to and remove. In general, we talked about the strength to mana ratio. In general, the strength to mana ratio for cards that are lower in mana cost is better. So you get more stats and more tempo by playing more cards. That the popular deck advice is lower your curve and add a finisher. This is the lower your curve part of that. If you can play more cards in a turn than your opponent, you will have an advantage in tempo. On the other hand, from a value side of things, if you can play something like Blade Storm, you're probably removing multiple cards that your opponent has played with one card of your own, allowing you to do other things with the remainder of your mana. If you play something like Freebooters, you can play more cards than your opponent. Your opponent plays 4, you play 6, you have an advantage. Or something like you talked about Queen of Herds Freeloader. It plays extra cards for you on your turn. You put down one card, all of a sudden 1 or 2 more pop out of your deck. Like that's a great example of value on the card advantage side.
it's interesting you bring both of these up because I actually wanted to contrast those two. Queen is effectively a guaranteed value play every time she's in your hand because A, you can cycle away any satyrs that are in
Well, a
your hand.
tempo play.
Well,
Yeah.
well, yes, that's true. But I'm talking in terms of yes, she will put an amazing amount of tempo on the board, but she's almost guaranteed to always play 2 or 3 cards. She herself plus the other 2. Whereas something like Bladestorm is capable of being a phenomenal value card. One of my cards could take away 3 or 4 of the ones you've already played off the board, depending upon levels and remaining strength of those units, correct? But it also
Correct.
can be a dud, right?
Absolutely. It depends on your opponent actually doing something with it. And I think there's a difference between card advantage in reactive cards and card advantage in proactive cards.
Right.
Right? Queen is
Exactly.
proactive. You can always play it, but also she doesn't move. The units that she pulls are likely to be not defensive in their nature. So you cannot play her reactively to save you and bail you out of a bad situation either. So there's certainly pros and cons either way. And you got to think about that when you're putting your deck together. To your point about the towers, something like a true shot tower or a siege assembly, those structures are providing you zero tempo when you play them. They don't actually do anything when you put them down. They don't trigger until your next turn. But when they do trigger, they provide a card advantage because they are essentially removing a unit that your opponent has played or dealing damage to their base in the case of siege assembly if your opponent chooses not to put anything in the path, and providing continual value by basically taking a card out of your opponent's hand. Your opponent always has to be thinking, am I going to throw my green prototypes or my gifted recruits ahead 1 row so that the true shot will remove it? If that's the case, then they're basically playing a 3-card hand as opposed to your 4-card hand every turn, and that's a powerful advantage.
That's exactly right. One of the cards that they play onto the board every turn gets negated for free as long as that true shot or siege assembly stays up, which is a huge card advantage when it gets to snowball over multiple turns. It really can turn a game around.
Now, I want to talk about I guess the last but not least type of resource, a little more implicit, but your base HP. I know I've talked about this in the previous episode, how sometimes intentionally letting an enemy unit walk into your base so that you have a better time of clearing in the next turn may actually be the best decision that can save you and win your games. Like instead of expending one card to like clear maybe like a 5 strength unit on your base, you could maybe ignore that 5 strength enemy on your base and choose to put that card elsewhere in a position that's much more favorable to you, like the second row when you're defending. Having that unit walk into your base, it's kind of like using your base as a way of dealing with that enemy instead of devoting an entire card for it. And that is one of the more obvious ways of using your base HP as a resource. But there are other more not so obvious ways of using base HP. Example would be something like Restless Goats. Restless Goats being 2 mana, 2 movement, and having 5 strength at level 5, that is some absurd stats to its mana ratio. But the reason why it's so absurd is because of that scary kind of drawback where that if Restless Goats die, it takes HP from your base. So if we really think about it, assuming the Restless Goats have done their job and did the damage and died, it's kind of like you're actually spending not just 2 mana, but 2 mana and 2 HP from your base. And that's why it has so much tempo, given with the strength and the movement for its very low mana cost. And that, I mean, that's from the Swarm perspective, but there's even like the Winter perspective. I mean, things like Ulf the Hammer and Underground Spring, they like straight up gain you base HP. And there are times when I play like those winter spells with Ulf and Underground Springs where I invest so much into just giving myself an absurd amount of base HP that in the late game I can just ignore almost all of their units and just focus on pressuring them because my base HP is like 30 or more, and it can just take the damage like no problem. Like that kind of value, that kind of having that kind of resource and recognizing you have that resource can really give you that advantage of the game, and it's not something to shrug off for sure. Because I mean, ultimately, base HP is what decides the winner of the game, right?
It doesn't matter if you win the game at 1 health or 20 health. So that's why I think another example of great value on using your base health as a resource is chip damage from overchargers or boomers. It invests a little bit of damage now in the payoff of future damage, but overchargers is a terrible tempo play on 4 mana, right? Like boomers don't move anymore, and right, boomers had movement before. Am I remembering?
You know,
Yeah,
you're remembering
dark
correctly.
times,
Yeah.
very dark times.
We had a whole drunken episode where you and I went back and forth on those boomers shouldn't move because of the chestnuts.
Right. But when those boomers did move, you know, the tempo was great. Now they're a poor tempo play, and really you're just playing them to invest in the chip damage so that you can finish your opponent off down the road. Like it's the same mechanic as that health gain, just kind of in reverse, offensively focused instead of defensively focused.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point.
Yeah, sometimes I make the joke like during my streams. I'm like, oh, you know, I could put Ulf in their base, but I could also just gain a lot of HP. That's like the same as damaging them, right?
Basically.
It effectively is.
It could be. It could be.
But that's
That's a numbers game. You gain less than you deal. So.
Yeah, no, that's why I said it was mostly a joke.
Mostly a joke, but you never, you know, sometimes you're trying to play around those overchargers and you're at
Yeah,
3 health.
it's definitely those kind of plays that require you to really dissect the situation and what your priorities and what are the things you're looking out for to decide what the best decision is. So those are more of a case by case basis type of thing.
So for people listening who are trying to understand, you have these resources, you can convert them into either tempo or value. Different deck styles will prefer to invest the resources differently. So Heck, Reckless Rush's Swarm deck, it invests all the mana into tempo, and it also invests all the like some of the life gain into tempo. Just forget it. All of it goes to tempo. Well, I shouldn't. I actually shouldn't say all of it,
Like,
because
it's just a serious focus on tempo compared to
for
value.
sure. But there is Potion of Growth, which is a value play. So
Sort of.
sort of.
I suspect it is a value play, right? You're investing in that unit strength now with the assumption that it'll pay off next turn. But because
Correct.
you play Forgotten Souls in your Reckless Rush
It
deck,
correct. It allows you to convert a value play into immediate tempo because of Forgotten Souls, which is the
Let me
same. Oh,
just
go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
let me just mention now that it's not easy to just go black and white saying like, oh, this is a tempo play, oh, this is a value play. What we want to drive forward is that tempo and value is a spectrum, and we'll talk about more of that later. But in the Reckless Rush type of situation, that deck kind of lies very, very far towards the tempo side of the spectrum.
For sure.
I think that deck defines the tempo side of the spectrum.
So guys, give me a couple of tempo examples. Sabaiku, give me an example of a trade-off between stats and movement in a tempo environment.
So we talked about this already a little bit. Gifted Recruits versus Lawless Herd, for example. One more strength versus one more movement. I think the important thing to understand is that a good tempo deck will focus mostly on a compromise between the two. You can have one or two units that don't move. You can have 2 or 3 units that move 2 but aren't as strong, but you can't really swing the pendulum too far in either direction. For a good example, I think you should look at a typical Swarm mid-range deck, which plays something like Doppelbox and Pan Heralds and Dreadfawns and Bucks. The focus there is on the value of buffing your units after you played them, but a lot of those units just do not have movement and cannot be played particularly defensively. So they are not actually a great example of a tempo deck, even though you're playing Swarm, and that's something you tend to think of as a faction that lends itself toward high tempo plays. We talked a little bit about conditional cards that have unusually high tempo. I think Hearthguards, for example, is very good to demonstrate what I'm talking about here. If you play it on your base or if you play it next to a structure, it has both high strength and high movement, and that's huge. Same with Twilight Prowlers. The problem with Twilight Prowlers is that because of the condition it has to be next to your base, it doesn't have the same high tempo impact that Hearthguards does. You cannot play it offensively in the same way.
Yeah, I can even give you a more value oriented 2-drop. Are you ready?
Hit me.
What is it?
Unstable Build. The most amount of stats on the board that could never possibly threaten your opponent's life total for 2 mana. Right? Because that's what it is. At the end of the day, it's putting it's a value investment. I'm trying to hold my front. That's why I play it. I don't play it to win the game. No one has ever won the game by playing Unstable Build.
Yeah. And like you said, it is a value investment because it can so very easily be comboed with a 2-mana fortification tonic. And bam, that's some serious tempo, right?
Well, it will be, right? At that point, when you convert it. So that's the point of value, right? The value on its own is kind of pointless if it never gets converted to tempo at some point. But that's what control decks try to do, is they try to invest, delay, and then there's this swing turn. And for those of you who've ever gotten to experience those kinds of swing turns, they are some of the most rewarding turns in any card game, when that aggressor's been, throwing punches at you, you've been, parrying as much as you can, and then suddenly you convert your value to tempo. And oh my.
So that segues really nicely to some very obvious value examples with like the control play style, where it kind of prioritizes value-oriented gameplay to keep that resource advantage over your opponent, and then eventually converting that into tempo. Things like, let's say, Void Surges, right? Or AoE cards, Victors or Blade Storm. These are the kind of value cards that can really give you a serious resource advantage over their opponents by dealing with multiple cards by using just one, or straight up clearing their front line, which is actually taking tempo away from your opponent, because like we mentioned, tempo is not just strength on the board but also how far and how much space they have to work with. So having those kind of value cards that give you that advantage over the opponent, which doesn't directly translate into winning the game, because I mean clearing the front line doesn't on its own win the game, but when you convert that advantage into tempo, such as like now that you've spent very little mana to clear the enemies compared to what the enemy has spent putting all of them, now you have extra resources from the advantage you gained to play your tempo cards and finally convert that advantage into something useful in winning the game.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times it happened to me early on when I had like level 14 base. I'd be playing Reckless Rush. I go first. I put 2 units down. I'm feeling good. My opponent passes. I put 2 more units down. I'm thinking I've won this game. And then level 5 Blade Storm just clears the whole board. And there went 4 cards of mine, my front and everything. And I'm just like, okay, well, let's start over, shall we?
Yeah, and I mean, I mean, like when you like something as oppressive as like Void Surgers, right? I mean, when you play Void Surgers to just like clear units, like if you played Void Surgers as like let's say your first card, and you cleared like 2 or 3 units, you don't need to devote your other 3 cards into clearing the units. You can now devote it into building your tempo, and this is the kind of significance and impact that value can give you in terms of winning the game. Other examples of value, it doesn't have to just be AoE, but things like, on death effects, chip damage especially. I mean, that's straight up taking HP from the enemy and bring you closer to winning the game, but it doesn't provide you that kind of board presence as many other cards can probably do better, right? Like from the overcharger's perspective, like as a 4 mana drop, it really doesn't give that much tempo, but it does give a lot of value because it brings the opponent closer to 0 HP. And these are the kind of things you find with value. It's not enough to win the game. Tempo is kind of seems to be the biggest way, the most obvious way to win the game. But value makes it so much easier to convert your advantage to tempo. I mean, I know
Right.
we mentioned before, but like structures, right? I mean, those investment cards like True Shot, Frozen Core, even Upgrade Point, those are the kind of stuff that don't win the game on their own, but they can seriously help you in not having to devote as much resources as you would normally need to win the game in the long run. And that's the kind of stuff you find in value.
And I think that we need to hammer that point home that really when you're playing for value, at some point you have to leverage that resource investment into a win. To back to what you said about upgrade point, it doesn't win you the game on its own when you play it, even if you play it next to some constructs. But when you get to continually trigger that effect and build up the board that your opponent can't deal with, then you start to outvalue them.
Yeah, for sure. There are decks that have been so far down the value end of the spectrum that they don't even have a runner, right?
Yeah, like winter
it's
spells.
like winter spells, or well, no, but I've seen Fort Tonic Mia upgrade point construct decks that had 0 runners, and it was just all about trying to make the largest board of giant friggin' minions possible.
And just crawl down one row at a time.
Right. Those decks would beat a winter control deck for sure because there's so much value being put on the board that no AoE could ever possibly clear all of it. But there are times where they can be out-tempoed, right? Rush decks can beat those decks because they can just run around it, and before you have time to convert all that value into actual base damage, right? It never gets converted to tempo fast enough in comparison to a rush deck, which is tempo from the get-go. And so that's why you need a blend. You need to this is the add a finisher portion of the conversation, right? It is possible to win a pure value game, but only against control decks.
All right. Well, I guess another really important thing to drive home is that I know we talk a lot about tempo versus value, but it's not black and white. So is life. It is a spectrum. It's like the far side would be tempo, and the other far side would be value. And if we were to fit like the three archetypes for each like faction, rush would be far in the tempo side, and control would be far in the value side. And right in the middle, we have some really nice balance, and that's what we call mid range.
You say that rush decks have a high tempo, but even there, you'll see something like Shady Ghoul, for example. When you play it to open the game on 3 mana, you're playing a weak unit. It has 1 strength, although admittedly 2 movement, but where that unit gets its power is from its value on the on death effect. You're playing a weak unit now to invest in your future positioning in holding the front for your later turns. It's definitely not black and white, like you said, but I agree with you that cards that combine tempo and value together are really especially powerful. To what you said earlier about Void Surgers, you can remove with 1 card, you can remove 2 cards, 3 cards, 4 cards that your opponent has played, while also simultaneously putting a body on the board. The body doesn't have great stats for the mana, but the fact that you're also removing your opponent's play, multiple units with 1 unit of your own, more mana than you spent with 5 mana of your own, allows you to do other things with your mana while also putting a body on the board. It's a nice combination of tempo and value, and that's why it sees so much play right now.
Right. But it is very dependent, as we talked about. Like level 5, my opponent hasn't played a single unit on the board. I play it. I'm playing a 5 mana 6 health unit. Meh. It's really not all that great tempo, right? It doesn't even have movement. It's just kind of weak and it sits there. However, at its maximum, if my opponent for whatever reason decided to make me a donut, it can do 48 points of damage and remove 8 units from the board, right? Like that's an insane amount of value potentially.
True, but I want to point out the difference between Void Surgers and something like Blade Storm, right? Blade Storm is also dead in your hand if your opponent doesn't play units, but at least Void Surgers, you can put something on the board. There's a modicum of tempo there.
Yeah.
Correct. Yes. It's just a very expensive lawless herd.
Yeah.
Well,
But
that's what it is.
very it's very good though in equals or like the lower levels with six
Oh, for
strength.
sure. Okay, so now that we've talked about all of this, what do we want to do with this information?
So we talked about the application toward deck building, right? Lower your curve and add a finisher is popular advice for a reason, because when you're trying to understand how to build a deck, you have to understand what the goal of your deck is. If you're playing a high value deck without the appropriate cards that let you do things like manipulate your mana or leverage your base health, then your deck is going to not work, and you're not going to understand that it's not because of how you're playing it and it's not because of your card levels, it's because you built it with a focus in the wrong area. There's only 12 cards in your deck. You don't have a card for every situation. It's just not practical. You have to understand why you're building your deck, what your deck is trying to do, and then put in the right cards that support that. And those cards are probably going to have a mix of tempo and value, but what the correct ratio is really depends on what you're trying to do there.
So, Arthas, you play a lot of control. Talk to me about how important it is to understand the correct timing for switching from value to tempo.
This takes a lot of experience and a lot of like limit testing, as I call it. When I'm trying to learn a new deck that I built, I tend to test out what are the best times you want to invest in certain things, such as like knowing when the best moments to play something like True Shot is, or is it better to just play 2 units instead of True Shot? What I love so much about Control is how much insight and in-depth thinking that is required to make the optimized plays, because there is a very delicate balance. And with with the control archetype being far on the value side of the spectrum, and like we mentioned before, value on its own isn't enough to win the game. You need to eventually convert that into something that will win you. I guess it's really hard to explain, but it really does go into experience, because there are a lot of very particular cases where you would prefer to not use your value cards, maybe save them for later for something more optimal, like, oh, if there's only like two enemies, I'll just play Void Surgers next turn, bait them on that side, and I'll play it for incredible value, and then I can invest on my units to pressure later on. It's really hard to explain real like right now in a very short amount of time, but you have to remember that value isn't enough, and you need to convert that kind of like resource advantage that you get from the value into something that does win you the game. A lot of the times it makes it easier for control players to gravitate towards chip cards, because chip cards are probably one of the easiest ways to convert your resource into something that wins you the game. I mean, if you didn't need to spend that much mana on clearing the enemies, then now you have extra mana to finally play something like Needle Blast or Ubis the Hunter. And that's something that a control player has to learn. It's how to manage their advantage and resources into something that will win you in the long run.
It might be why winter control is the most popular control archetype, because when you play Aaron and Gift of the Wise, it's real easy to figure out when you're supposed to convert to tempo.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
But that goes back to our original point about how value cards that are board state dependent can be, like Void Surgers, incredibly swingy, and they can turn a game in your favor, but sometimes they can be duds. But value cards that are guaranteed every time reliable are insane. And Gift of the Wise, Aaron, that combination, freebooters on top of it. So now not only do I get a mana advantage, but I also then get a card advantage.
Yeah.
Like all that stuff, and it's guaranteed. There's never a time where you're like, oh, actually they didn't have enough units on the board, so Aaron doesn't trigger.
Right, exactly. There's no condition to be met. All you have to do is have the cards in your hand.
It's a for sure the most reliable control faction because of Gift. Sabaiku, we've talked a lot about how tempo cares first and foremost about smashing your opponent's face. And then the second rule of Swarm Rush is you also smash your opponent in the face. But on occasion, tempo does actually have to make a decision about trying to remove some of your opponent's value from the board, does it not?
It does happen, unfortunately. Some of the times you do have to play defense.
Unfortunately, you have to think about the other half of the game. Oh man. Rush
When you're
player.
facing when you're facing an opponent who maybe outlevels you, when you're worried about runners because you've let some units go by in an effort to keep your own front, you might have to play conservatively. But also just in the opening turns, when you have 5 mana and you're going to play 2 units, if you're going to play, for example, Lime Limbs and Gifted Recruits on 5 mana, because that's what you have in your hand and it uses your mana efficiently, it plays the most cards that you can. Putting those Lime Limbs just directly into the opponent's base on an early turn might not be the right thing to do. You're not looking for that kind of value from the chip damage, not yet. You're looking for the value from holding your front, because if you get cleared, you're not getting any additional damage in. Understanding when do you go all in on base damage and when do you play a little bit more conservatively. It's, like Arthur said, it's situational. It's very difficult to try to explain in a 30 or 60-second bite in the podcast, but it's definitely something you need to understand the cards in your deck, why they're there, and what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, I'll go back a couple of months now, but back when Herald's Hymn cost 6 and Hysteria cost 2, Hysteria in Reckless's rush deck was my favorite card. I can't tell you how many mirror matches I won where my opponent was clearly setting up for a Herald's Hymn on 6, but on my turn 6, I would play Devastators into a corner, protected, and then Hysteria 2 of his units together, taking what should usually be an offensive card and use it as a 2-mana defensive value play to remove my opponent's resources from the board, just enough such that Herald's Hymn is no longer lethal, but the Devastators will be. Those kinds of plays, I don't know that there's like an easy, here's a manual for understanding when you're playing tempo, when to use a card for value, kind of like, bulleted list of, or flow chart kind of thing. Like you just, to Arthur's point, I think you just need to play the deck long enough to be comfortable and familiar with how each of the cards can be used in the alternative form. So you think of it as a tempo card, but sometimes it can be value. And to have an understanding of when it's appropriate to do so. Prior to that, though, what we're trying to help here is understanding how to build a deck so it has that flexibility. A pure value deck will fail. A pure tempo deck will fail. You need to have some amount of blend within the spectrum, but also that blend varies wildly depending upon, to Sabaiku's point, what are you trying to do with the deck in the first place?
If nothing else, I've hoped we help players understand that execution is never a good choice for your rush deck.
That's exactly right. Execution has 0 tempo. It is a pure value play. Get it out of there. Stop,
and
please.
On the other side, I mean, a control deck, Summon Militia is probably not the best in terms of stalling the game and removing the enemy's board presence.
Yeah, no, and you see
You can get it for free from your Aaron.
What value! What amazing value! Well, that ends the main portion of this episode, which means that it's time for me to remind you to please follow us on Twitter at Brewed Sages. Again, you can always email us at thebrewedsages@gmail.com. I don't believe we've received too much in the way of listeners' comments from last time. I will give a quick apology to anyone who got the bonus episode of me reading bedtime stories. It was just kind of a whimsical thing to do last week because I missed doing this with my my 2 buddies here. Guys, I really did miss doing this last week. But I'm glad we're back doing it again this week. Arthas, what do you think? Was the week off okay?
I think it was. It's just, I got surprised. It was like, oh, I have to do a podcast today. Forgot about that.
Spoken like a true college kid.
Yeah. But you know what? I definitely missed it. This is really fun to do with you guys.
And Sabaiku, how about you?
I don't enjoy this at all. I don't know what you're talking about.
Wow. Yeah, no, he's just a paid actor.
That's it. Rolling in the dough. All right, well, that's going to do it for this episode. For Arthas and Sabaiku, I am Freeloader. We are the Brewed Sages, reminding you to please stay hydrated.